Good morning. Now we are continuing with the second class on pharynx, and in this session we'll be going to deal with the interior of pharynx. So you already know the subdivisions of pharynx. The pharynx is being subdivided into nasopharynx, oropharynx and laryngopharynx. So what is it? Nasopharynx means it is that part which lies behind the nasal cavity. This is the nasopharynx. This is the nasal cavity. Behind the nasal cavity, you find the nasopharynx. Behind the oral cavity, this is the oral cavity. Behind the oral cavity, you find the oropharynx. And this is the larynx. Behind that larynx, you find the hypopharynx, otherwise termed as the laryngopharynx. So now we are starting with the nasopharynx. So this nasopharynx communicates with what all? One you already know. What is it? It is communicating with the nasal cavity through what? It is through the posterior nasal aperture or choana. Posterior choana. Fine. So this is the nasal cavity. This is the nasopharynx, and through the posterior nasal aperture there, the nasal cavity will communicate with the nasopharynx. It is communicating, this nasopharynx is communicating down with the oropharynx through this region, and that is what is termed as nasopharyngeal isthmus. So through nasopharyngeal isthmus, nasopharynx will communicate with the oropharynx. One more communication is there. Are you appreciating the lateral wall? There you are seeing an opening there. Are you seeing that opening? That is the opening of auditory tube. So through that, the nasopharynx is communicating through the middle ear. So these are the three communications you find for the nasopharynx. One, with the nasal cavity through the posterior nasal aperture, through or into the oropharynx through the nasopharyngeal isthmus, and into the middle ear through auditory tube. Read that. Anteriorly, communicating with the nasal cavities through the choana or the posterior nasal aperture, with the oropharynx through the nasopharyngeal isthmus, and into the middle ear through auditory tube. Okay. So that communication of with the middle ear through the auditory tube, that is how through the auditory tube the pressure is equalized on either side of the tympanic membrane. Because of this communication with the nasopharynx, from there you find the auditory tube finally opening on towards the middle ear. So now you know the three communications of the nasopharynx. Now we go to the walls of the nasopharynx. When we are dealing with any region, we will describe it as anterior wall. Nasopharynx will have an anterior wall, a posterior wall, a roof, a floor, and a lateral wall. It's very simple. Look at that. This is the nasopharynx. This is the nasopharynx, and this nasopharynx has got a roof. So this is the roof. This is the posterior wall. This is the anterior wall. This is the floor. Fine. And what you see here, that is the lateral wall. So we'll start with each. So first is the roof of the, this is the roof. The roof of the, this region. This is the roof of the nasopharynx. So the roof of the nasopharynx is formed by the body of the sphenoid plus the basilar part of occiput bone. So the body of sphenoid plus the basilar part of the occiput bone. So this roof becomes continuous with the posterior wall, and this posterior wall is reinforced by the anterior arch of atlas. That anterior arch of atlas will be covered by the pharyngobasilar fascia, then the superior constrictor, like that. Okay, so roof, body of sphenoid plus the basilar part of the occiput continuous with the posterior wall. The posterior wall is formed by the anterior arch of atlas. So what about this wall, anterior wall? This anterior wall, through the anterior wall you find the nasopharynx is communicating with the nasal cavity through the posterior nasal aperture. So anterior wall is over. What is it? It is communicating with the nasal cavity through the posterior nasal aperture. Posterior wall is formed by the anterior arch of atlas. Roof is formed by what? The basi or the body of the sphenoid with the basilar part of the occipital bone. And what about the floor? This is the region that is termed as the floor. So the floor is formed by soft palate. This is the soft palate. You are seeing that soft palate. So one part it is by the soft palate and one part here. That is what is termed as the nasopharyngeal isthmus. So floor by the soft palate, partly by the soft palate and partly by the nasopharyngeal isthmus. What was this nasopharyngeal isthmus? Do you remember? It was through the nasopharyngeal isthmus that oropharynx communicates with the nasopharynx. So read that the walls of the nasopharynx will have a roof, a floor, an anterior wall, a posterior wall and a lateral wall. So read that the roof and the posterior wall is continuous or sloping, and you find the roof is formed by the body of the sphenoid with the basilar part of the occipital bone, and the posterior wall is formed by the anterior arch of atlas. So in the initial statement it is a roof formed by the two bones, posterior wall is formed by the anterior arch of atlas. Fine. So some features you find in the roof, what are they? At the junction of the roof and the posterior wall, you find one mucosa associated lymphoid tissue, one MALT, mucosa M, mucosa associated lymphoid tissue. And that lymphoid tissue which you find very close to the roof of the nasopharynx, and that is what is termed as nasopharyngeal tonsil. Have you heard this term before? If yes, where? Good. That was one counterpart of the Waldeyer's ring. Do you remember the Waldeyer's ring? The Waldeyer's ring is a lymphoid accumulation you find in the submucosa of the pharynx that is produced by 4 lymphoid tonsils. What were they? One was the nasopharyngeal tonsil, 2 palatine tonsil, 3 tubal tonsil and 4 lingual tonsil. So remember, in the roof of the nasopharynx you find the first tonsil of the Waldeyer's ring, and that is the nasopharyngeal tonsil. And you find a small bursa extending into that, and that is what is termed as the pharyngeal bursa or pouch of Lashka. Fine. And in front of the pouch of Lashka, you find a small dimple in the mucosa, and that is what is termed as Ractase pouch. That Ractase pouch you have learned earlier when we are studying about the development of anterior pituitary. Do you remember that? Okay. So these 3 features you find in the roof. One is the presence of nasopharyngeal tonsil, a small pouch extending or bursa extending into that, and that is what is termed as the pharyngeal bursa or pouch of Lashka. And 3, in front of that you find a small dimple, and that is the remnant of Ractase pouch. Look at that figure. You are seeing the roof. Are you seeing the roof? This is the roof. This is the posterior wall that is formed by the anterior arch of atlas. This is the body of sphenoid plus the occipital bone there. This is the anterior wall through which it communicates with the nasal cavity. So this is the posterior nasal aperture there. This is the floor. Floor is formed by soft palate and nasopharyngeal isthmus. So now we are talking about the features in the roof. You are seeing a tonsil there, and that is the nasopharyngeal tonsil. Into that you find a small pouch. You are seeing that small pouch there or bursa there. That is what is termed as a nasopharyngeal bursa or the pouch of Lashka. In front of that you are seeing a small dimple. That is the remnant of Ractase pouch. So these 3 features in the roof you can remember. Fine. Now we are coming to the lateral wall. What do you see here? This region, this is the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. And once you concentrate on the lateral wall, what is the striking feature you find in the lateral wall of the nasopharynx? That is the opening of auditory tube or tubal opening is there. Are you seeing that opening there? This one, tubal opening, fine. And just above the tubal opening you find an elevation there. Just above that you're finding an elevation in the roof and the posterior part. That is what is termed as the tubal elevation. And on that, or very close to that tubal elevation, you find the second tonsil. That is what is termed as tubal tonsil. So tubal tonsil is the second counterpart of Valdeir's ring. One we have already studied in the roof, that was nasopharyngeal tonsil. The second in the lateral wall, that is the tubal tonsil. So now you find two folds running on either side, or running from the auditory tube. One is this fold running like that, and then second is this fold here running towards the soft palate. So I've already told you how you name the folds. Anything starting from auditory tube will start with salpingo. Okay, so from the auditory tube going toward the pharyngeal wall, so that is a salpingopharyngeal fold, like that, salpingopharyngeal fold, and the other fold from the auditory tube going towards the palate. So what do you call it? Salpingopalatine fold. Fine. So read that. Auditory tube, the lateral wall has got the opening of the auditory tube. Just above that in the roof you find the tubal elevation. This tubal elevation will contain the tubal tonsil, and extending down you have got two folds, one from the auditory tube towards the pharyngeal wall. So what do you call it? Salpingopharyngeal fold. And the other one is salpingopalatine, from the salping towards the soft palate. The other one from the salping towards the posterior pharyngeal wall. So this salpingopharyngeal fold is produced by the underlying salpingopharyngeus muscle, one of the longitudinal muscles we discussed earlier. Do you remember that? Okay. So these are the features you find in the lateral wall. One more thing you have to add here is, just behind this tubal elevation you find a small fossa, and that is what is termed as fossa of Rosenmuller. Why this fossa of Rosenmuller becomes important is, that is one of the very common sites for a nasopharyngeal carcinoma. So this much features in the lateral wall you can remember. What are they? One, auditory tube, tubal elevation, tubal tonsil, salpingopharyngeal fold, salpingopalatine fold, and fossa of Rosenmuller. The three things of the roof you can remember. What were they? One, roof, the things we discussed earlier. What were they? One, the presence of nasopharyngeal tonsil. Two, a bursa, pharyngeal bursa. Three, bracteus pouch. So now we have finished the roof. We have finished the lateral wall. Now we come to the floor. So I already told you the floor here is formed by the soft palate and by the nasopharyngeal isthmus. Soft palate here and the nasopharyngeal isthmus. So I told you, through the nasopharyngeal isthmus, the nasopharynx communicates with the oropharynx. So you should know some more details about this nasopharyngeal isthmus. So what is it? What are the boundaries of this nasopharyngeal isthmus? It is bounded anteriorly by soft palate here. Posteriorly you find the Pacevens ridge. Do you remember the Pacevens ridge? The palatopharyngeus muscle plus a superior constrictor forming the Pacevens ridge, and the side walls is also contributed by the palatopharyngeus muscle. So what happens in front, the soft palate, on either side you get the palatopharyngeus muscle. The palatopharyngeus muscle along with the superior constrictor will form the Pacevens ridge, which will reinforce that nasopharyngeal isthmus posteriorly. So read that. The anterior part by the soft palate, posterior part by the nasopharyngeal isthmus. Nasopharyngeal isthmus has got in front soft palate, behind Pacevens ridge, and on either side palatopharyngeal arch. So finish the floor. So what was the structure which you find anteriorly? Or anteriorly you find the nasal, posterior nasal aperture, through which it communicates with the nasal cavity, and posteriorly you find the anterior arch of atlas. So with that we finish the walls of the nasopharynx. Now we come to the applied anatomy. So what is this posterior rhinoscopy? The nasopharynx is inspected through a procedure termed as the posterior rhinoscopy. So what we do is, through a tongue depressor. We use a tongue depressor, we'll depress the tongue, and then we introduce a rhinoscopic mirror into the nasopharynx. And then what we do is we'll have a headlight, and the headlight will be focusing on the mirror so as to get an illumination of the nasopharynx on the mirror. And then we'll be able to look at that nasopharynx and look whether the things there are normal. So that is what is termed as posterior rhinoscopy. Second one is nasopharyngeal carcinoma. This nasopharyngeal carcinoma is very common in the fossa of Rosenmuller. What was that fossa of Rosenmuller? Do you remember that? That was an area which you find just lying behind the tubal elevation. Okay. And one peculiarity of this tumor is that the tumor there will infiltrate the nearby structures. If it infiltrates the nearby cranial nerves, it will produce its effect. Why? Because of its proximity to cranial base. If it infiltrates the soft palate, it can lead to immobility on the same side of the palate. Auditory tube, if it infiltrates, it can lead to deafness there, conductive deafness. To the nasal cavity, can lead to epistaxis. Lymphatic spread can occur to the cervical lymph nodes in such a way can either infiltrate into the nearby structures or to the lymph nodes because of the lymphatic spread. So these two applied aspects of nasopharynx, one is posterior rhinoscopy and nasopharyngeal carcinoma, you should be able to remember. So I think I'll stop the nasopharynx there, and in the next session we'll deal with the oropharynx. So I'll stop here. Thank you.